Today you will hear from Jason Schneider, the director of Despite the Loss, a documentary focusing on physical differences, specifically limb differences. We discuss his documentary and what it required for Jason to make this documentary, and he then shares insights regarding how one can achieve self-acceptance no matter the circumstances and in turn thrive. So tune in.
Through that tragedy taught me life is finite. You really have a short window to take what it is from life that you want and enjoy it.
You can go back to that day, February 18th, 1990, and change what happened. My honest answer is I wouldn't change it.
You're just going to have to go through it, and your strength is going to be found in simply going through it and being authentic and real in the process.
I was talking with my family, the care doctor today, and she turned around to me and she looked at me and she was like, do you think that you'll eventually beat this? And I was sort of like, yeah, that's probably what I'm trying to do.
No, nothing will ever take away the pain of my daughter not being here. It's my reality.
Well, I know what my body's going to do to me. I've got a wheelchair in my future. You know what I've been looking for?
What's that?
One with off-road wheel.
Just remembering me as I am, happy and energetic and full of life no matter what.
You can expect life to kick you in the teeth, but you always get back up no matter what, and you just keep going.
Yo, what's up, everyone? This is Scott Davidson, and just so you know, you can find out more about Living Adaptive and previous shows, context for guests, and a bunch of other good stuff at livingadaptive.com. Go there. Jason Schneider, you talk a lot about thriving despite loss. In your case, you had to accept losing your hand at a young age and dealing with the fallout. We're going to jump into what that meant and what you produced after that. But first, what is it about accepting your difference, in your case, limb loss, that was something you couldn't fully embrace for so many years?
The reason why I couldn't embrace it was because I didn't want to embrace it. I basically didn't see myself as someone with a limb difference, even though I obviously met that description. So I just wanted to be considered a normal person, so to speak. So I never even I basically locked that part of myself away deep down inside and just ignored it. And even though through the years I had these, feelings of insecurity, or I had these self-doubts, or I had anxiety about the way people looked at me in public spaces, and I really kind of hid my arm for a long time. I just still didn't deal with it. On the surface, it was still like, well, nothing's wrong. I'm just a regular person. I'm not disabled. I'm not any of these things. And it was hard to finally start to face that. It was actually by accident. Making the film is how I started to actually really realize that I had to unpack that stuff.
What was one of, or some of your worst fears you stared at, you faced when you looked in the mirror?
So I think probably the worst fear, and I talk about this in the film, is I was constantly worried what strangers thought of me, which now, coming out on the other side, feeling like a completely different person after making the film, it seems so strange that I even had that issue. But my big thing would be, like, if I was in public spaces, I would think, oh, well, this person's going to see me. They're going to stare at me. They're going to notice I'm missing my hand. And they're going to think, oh, his life must be so limited. He can't do these things. And that really bothered me for some reason. And I, again, looking back at it now, I think, well, that was so silly. Like, this is a completely random stranger that I'm seeing on the subway. What do I even care what they think about me? But that was something that was really hard for me, was having that impression. I never wanted people to think that I was limited or had this, sad life or something. And I don't honestly believe now that most people do think like that. I think people look at someone with a limb difference and they notice the difference, but then they probably just go, oh, and they go about their business, but that's something that really, really bothered me for a long, long time.
What happened? What made you join the ranks of people that had various challenges, man, physical challenges?
I lost my hand as a young kid. I had an accident, and the funny thing is I don't really like to talk about the accident a lot, because I feel that a lot of times stories with people with limb differences always focus on the accident or focus on their difference instead of rather their story of what they're doing or who they are as a person. So that's something that I actually struggled with even making the film. I mean, for a long time, I wasn't even going to discuss my accident in the film, because I was like, well, why does this need this? Like, let these people see what I'm doing. Let these people see what these other people are doing with their lives. And why do I have to tell them this sad, violent story of how it happened? I ultimately came around the other side and realized that it was almost for me like a therapeutic thing to kind of address it in the film, because I had never done. But yeah, it's kind of a weird, contentious kind of topic for me, because I don't want that to be the sole focus. I'm not that I'm saying that you're going to do that, obviously, and you're someone who can relate. But yeah, so most of the time I just tell people, I was one of those kids on the 4th of July, lost my hand with fireworks. It's like what's happened to a lot of kids over the years. And I was 12 when it happened.
When you encounter something significant, when you see individuals that have encountered something significant, there's obviously probably some common traits of those that thrive. They find a way to thrive despite the loss, despite the challenges, and they move forward. What are those traits that you see? Like one or two?
Well, definitely one I would say is resilience. Obviously everyone that I met in the film was just so resilient in just the thought that I'm going to do these things and nothing is going to stop me. Like, every single person that I interviewed and spent time with for the film, never once, even when they were younger. I mean, I'm sure, a lot of them, we all have doubts. People that have all their appendages have doubts when they want to try something new or learn a new skill. But it was always that resilience to say, like, well, I'm just going to figure out a way to do this because this is kind of the thing I want to do. And that to me was something that I recognized right away, because having never really associated with any amputees, people with limb differences before making my film, that was kind of a real realization for me going into this film, was when I met the first person that I interviewed and talked to them. I was like, this guy is just like me. Like, he is resilient.
Yeah.
He's and that was just a shock to me, because in a way, not to sound like I'm trying to pat myself on the back, but I thought, not knowing any other people with limb differences, I thought that was something that was maybe unique to me, that for some reason I had this resilience and that's how I was able to get through it, whether it's my personality, the way I was raised, or, XYZ. So then starting to meet these other people with limb differences, I was like, oh, wow, we all have this. Like, we all share this resilience. And that I thought was really cool. So that would be the first thing I would say. And then the second thing, which is I think one of the things that I don't know if I mentioned it to you when I reached out to you on social media, but the other thing is basically out of the box thinking. And I think that's something that we also all possess. And I think it probably comes as a necessity, obviously, because we are different, and the way we do things, you have to think about it differently. So it necessitates this outside the box thinking that I think ends up being like a real asset for us, because we look at situations differently. Even just I'm a filmmaker for Despite the Loss. I produced, directed, edited, but I'm just an editor by trade, working in the industry for my day job. And a lot of times I'd be on projects and work for somebody, and people would just say, well, this is not possible. You can't edit this like this, or you can't film this like this, or you can't tell this story like this. And I would say, why not? Because those people were much more rigid in the ideas of way things had to work or would work. And I think because of my background, having this kind of out of the box thinking to adapt to so many different situations just because I'm limb different makes me think, well, why not for anything for that matter? Why can't I do this? Why can't I do it this way? Just because it wasn't done like this, what's to say I can't do it like that? So that I think is just a huge asset, and something that if you really think about it, for everybody with a limb difference or just disability as a whole, can really benefit you if you think about it that way.
A lot of people do have trouble accepting their differences, man. And
for sure.
Yeah, you encountered a bunch of that. I mean, you really talked about it a ton, and Despite the Loss. What are methods that are useful when coming to terms with accepting something you can't change, like your differences?
I think that's a tough question, because honestly, if I look back at making the film, it was hard. It was very hard. And I don't know if I really come to any definitive conclusions in the film as far as that goes. So it's an interesting question to think about. I think for me, only being able to really speak for myself, obviously having practicing self-love, I think, was something that was really important to kind of get to that place. Like, for a long, long time, I did not really have a lot of love for myself, because I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin, and I didn't like the way, I didn't even like to see myself in pictures if you could see that I was missing my hand. that kind of stuff, I think it ate at me, and it really affected my life below the surface in ways that I didn't realize. So I think the way that I kind of ended up coming to terms with that and adapting was kind of through this self-love, learning to practice self-love, but also just like the repetition of it. So, you have your good days and bad days. I mean, there are still days, even now after making the film and kind of completely changing the way I look at myself as a person, there are still days where someday I'm walking down the street and I see somebody stare at me and I get a little self-conscious and I put my hand in my pocket, or I put my arm in my pocket. And then there are other days that I'm walking out the house and I'm feeling really confident and I see somebody stare at me and I just give them a smile and I keep walking. But I think, like many times when you're trying to change your behavior, even regardless of limb difference, it's kind of like that repetition, that cognitive repetition. So the more you do it, the easier it's going to get. So I would say probably just starting small, making these small changes or trying to be more comfortable with yourself, putting yourself out there in ways that you're not comfortable with. And it's going to suck and you might backtrack many times, but the more you just continue to push yourself to do it, the more natural it becomes. And then eventually that kind of mindset and that the way you perceive yourself and the way you act in the world, I think takes over. And because it's through repetition. I know it's just kind of a strange, I don't know if that really makes sense.
It does.
But yeah.
You went out and you made a documentary, and this documentary is a full-length documentary. It's, like an hour and 28 minutes, and it's really good. And I suggest everybody go rent or purchase. You get it on Amazon right now. You can also, eventually it will be expanded out to other options, I'm sure, as time goes on. But what was the first thing you did to get started, to be able to start, to actually make this?
Well, so the interesting thing about that is, again, everything was a process, much like I was just saying, the repetition of kind of looking at yourself in a certain way and going out there in the world. It changes over time. It'll change you over time. When I first started the film, I never wanted to be known as the guy with one hand. So I really never would have even thought to make a film like this. And what happened was, because I worked in documentaries for a living as an editor, a lot of times I would just be talking with colleagues and they would say, "Oh, what are you doing this weekend?" And I would say, "Oh, well, I'm building this car. I'm going to go race it." And they would say, "You build and race cars? Why aren't you making a film about that?" And I would say, "Why?" Not even realizing that to them, that was something significant because I was missing a hand, And then the minute they would kind of point that out, I would shut it down and be like, "No, I'm not making a film about that. There's no reason. I'm just like everybody else." But so the film actually started with an idea. I just thought it would be fun to find other people with limb differences, pushing the limits of their disability, so to speak. I'm, making air quotes right now that you can't see, but I wanted to find these people really doing these things that were just incredible that honestly, able-bodied people would think was impossible. But what ended up happening was, as I started to make the film, I think I mentioned earlier, that was the first time I interacted with anyone else that had a limb difference. And talking to them, I realized we had so many similarities, but also made me start to reevaluate myself and the way I look at the world. And so it was a slow process, and the film started to change it to the point where I was like, well, wait a minute, what does the word disabled mean? Why am I considered disabled if I do all these things? I started to examine the stigmas associated with disability and how it affected me. And, in the end, the film completely changed, or at least what I set out to make with the film completely changed. And it turned into this journey film where I reevaluated my whole life and how I looked at myself in the world and disability. But it didn't start out that way. So it was a fluid process that constantly changed as I made the film and got exposed to more people with limb differences.
And coming out of this, how much work would you say it takes to do something so big like this, man? It's got to be countless hours.
Oh yeah, I mean, honestly, it's been 8 years of my life, and it's the first 6 years were pretty much part-time because I've fully funded this film myself, partly because I was afraid if I got grants or got money from other people, they would potentially want to change the story. One of the big reasons I also wanted to make this film was because I didn't like the way disability was portrayed in cinema. And I felt like a lot of times people's stories were turned into inspiration porn. And I was so afraid that if I accepted a grant or if I got a partner or something to help fund the project, that would come with strings attached. And the story would then morph into this more inspiration porn kind of story, because I would be getting these notes from other people and I would have to kind of incorporate them into the film. So in order to keep it completely independent and under my control, I would basically work for 6 months, save up a little money, go on a shoot. I'd find somebody, I'd save up some money, I'd go on a shoot. So the process took forever. And it wasn't until probably the last 2 years where I was like, if I don't devote my life to this 100%, I'm never going to get it done. So the last 2 years have pretty much been 24/7 on it. I mean, I've spent so much time, I can't even count the hours. I mean, I have over 100 hours of footage, and I've probably spent hundreds of hours editing it and everything, the color correcting, mixing, all that kind of stuff. But it was a big journey. It's a long process. I definitely don't recommend making a film like this without a support network. I would never do this again on my own. I would definitely have some help for sure.
You've had a number of years to live with your challenges. And what would you like? I ask this question a lot. I think there's something to be said for it. Like, if you could go back to yourself, and you had your accident and you're now coming out of it, you've got a level head. And what would you say to yourself? Like, if you could go back and say something, what would you say?
Yeah, I would probably have to say, like, just to embrace who you are. Like I said, I think a lot of time before I made the film was spent trying to kind of ignore my limb difference. And because I really didn't fit into, even though I considered myself able-bodied, I didn't obviously fit into that world. I mean, I was missing a hand. And I think for so many years, I tried to kind of slam a square peg into a round hole, and I think on the surface, I thought it was working, but I don't think it ever really quite was. And I think, so that's what I think I would tell my younger self, is just kind of embrace who you are, because I think it would have made my life obviously a lot easier, and it wouldn't have taken me making a documentary to kind of realize the version of myself that I am now, and be comfortable in my own skin, which I'm much more now. The film has really transformed me as a person, regardless of its whatever you want to say, commercial success or something. It literally changed the entire way I look at myself in the world. So yeah, I mean, embracing who I was much earlier would have expedited that process, I imagine, for sure.
I think there's a paradox that you live. You, like, when we started this interview, you lived a paradox, and like your life has been like that. But when we started this interview, you mentioned that, hey, I was insecure. I didn't feel like I was maybe as tough as others, let's just say, internally, externally, whatever. And when you came out of this video, you might start to embrace the idea that like, these challenges did make you tougher than your average. And it did make you somebody that could traverse very difficult things and come out the other side with a message. And you put that message into the film. So it's a pretty amazing venture that occurred. We can kind of see you grow through the process, which is really cool. Have you gotten to that part where like you really embrace the idea maybe you are a lot tougher than you think you are?
Oh, for sure. And I don't know if necessarily the way I looked at myself was from a perspective of a lack of toughness. I think I looked at myself more because I knew I was resilient, like, because I got all these things done. I mean, I was playing bass and building cars and all that stuff. So, but it was more the way I felt the world looked at me that really ate at me. I think it was the perception of other people that I might be weak or unable to do things that bothered me more than actually in practice. And again, that's something I learned while making the film. I learned that a lot of these feelings that I had were in my head, and they weren't necessarily 100% rational. And I had to unpack them and really discuss them to kind of realize that and come around that on the other side.
Where do you see yourself going? And also, how do people kind of hang out with you? How can they be part of what you're doing, man?
Well, I mean, I've got a bunch of social media outlets for the film. Instagram Instagram is Despite the Loss Film, at Despite the Loss Film, and Twitter and Facebook is just at Despite the Loss. I've got the website, despitetheloss.com, and so people, if they want to interact with me in the film, they can obviously follow me on social media, send me an email. And, and then just, watch the film on Amazon. It's on Amazon, available for purchase or rental. But yeah, I would say social media is probably the best way, or sending an email is the best way if they want to interact with me and talk to me.
Thanks, man, for coming on today. I encourage our listeners to go reach out to Jason Schneider. Check him out. Check out his movie, Despite the Loss. And you can find that on Amazon or in the show notes. You can just click the link there and we will navigate you right to the movie. You can rent or purchase. Remember, go to livingadaptive.com to find previous episodes, show notes, contacts for guests like this guest, links to social media accounts, and a bunch of other good stuff. So go there. Peace.